Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
December 7th, 1941 was the day that America woke up to the harsh new reality that war could no longer be avoided.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
That day, a Japanese task force unleashed a surprise attack on the American military installation on the island of Oahu in Hawaii.
It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned.
This was the end result of strained diplomatic tensions between the two nations that had finally breached the breaking point. The Japanese attack, with the exception of the American carriers, had put the Pacific Fleet essentially out of action. The United States started the war losing, enraged, and already on the defensive. FDR knew that the only thing that would be worse would be to lose morale. He surmised what he wanted.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Hello, everybody at home. This is Nitin from Flashpoint History. I've got with me Craig from the Pacific. How do you want me to introduce you?
Oh, you just say Craig from the Pacific War Channel? Sure.
Okay. Craig from the Pacific War Channel. And we're here to talk about the Doolittle raid today. We're going to try kind of a new format, just kind of a back and forth to talk about this incredible time. And all right, let's just go ahead and get started. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan had emerged as a power to be reckoned with. It had undergone rapid industrialization during what was known as the Meiji Restoration and was able to hold on against the West on various different fronts. The Russians were soundly defeated at the naval battle of Tsushima, which came as a shock to the Western world, which saw East Asia as merely a place to be exploited in one person's sphere of influence or another. From that point onwards, Japan's ambition had grown. It became their doctrine that if they were to compete as a world power, they would have to expand in order to secure resources, food, labor, etc. for that prestige. By the 1930s, the Empire of Japan had heavily invested its forces in East Asia, with large contingents operating in Korea, Southeast Asia, and China. Imperial forces would bring untold suffering to those that it conquered, inflicting massacre to the civilian populations. Eventually, this would strain relations with other powers, namely the United States. As far back as 1918, the Imperial Defensive Policy designated America as enemy number one. But ironically, it was the United States that the Japanese relied on for raw material and its fuel. And this reliance they saw as a vulnerability and as a humiliation. Then, in the summer of 1941, the United States placed an embargo on the most valuable resource, oil. Japan now stood at a crossroads: either relinquish its military ambitions for an empire, which was unpalatable for its ruling party, or attain the resources it needed by further conquest in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Australian archipelago.
Japan was going to unleash the Nanshinran strategy. They had debated within the Joint Chiefs of Staff of their military what was the best options going forward because of the resource issue. Originally, the IGA thought that they were going to go with Hoko Shinran, which was to attack the USSR. But that was deemed insanity, and there was no proof of concept because they couldn't prove they would find the resources they need in Siberia. So they were going to have to seize, like you said, any places in the Southeast Indies. So the Dutch East Indies was the place where they would get rubber and oil, the most specific resources that they needed. In order to get that, they were going to have to go to war absolutely with Britain and with the United States simply because of the Philippines being there. So the Philippines was to be attacked simultaneously. It actually gets hit at the exact same moment as Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor, as outlined by Yamamoto, had to achieve absolute secret, a surprise element to it, or else it wouldn't work. The whole idea of the operation in Yamamoto's mind was to give the Japanese Pacific Fleet enough time to seize all the territories it needed to secure the resources for a prolonged war. And he estimated if they could knock out the United States Pacific Fleet, they'd have about 6 months at minimum, if not a full year. But he couldn't promise any other operations after that.
And Yamamoto himself was not a big proponent for attacking the United States in the first place. I mean, he was commander in chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet during the Second World War, but he'd also spent considerable time in the United States, correct?
Yeah, so he got to study in the United States, and he did something most high-ranking Japanese officers never got to do. He got to visit factories. That was a crucial component to his mentality. He got to see a Ford factory, for example, and how they produced anything you can imagine. And in Japan, the way that production works was completely different. And for lack of better words, it wasn't very modern. Japan could create great armaments, much similar to Germany and their model, but they didn't have assembly lines for these things. They couldn't build them en masse, and they could not build them fast. So he knew that at any given point, if the United States were to turn on the switch, production would have overwhelmed Japan.
Yeah, I think one of his statements was that he was not necessarily confrontational, but he was maybe perhaps talking to one of his aides, and he's like, you haven't seen the industrial output of Detroit.
Yes.
You haven't seen the naval yards of the East Coast. You haven't seen the oil fields of Texas. You don't know what we're dealing with.
And ironically, his rival, Hideki Tojo, who also went to the United States, spent his whole time sitting on a train. And he went across the country. He never took the time to actually do anything in America. He was extremely ignorant, and most of the Japanese were fairly ignorant of the production capabilities of someone like Adolf Hitler as well. Hitler was very ignorant to the production capabilities of the United States. Both Hitler and many high-ranking members of the Japanese army and navy assumed the Americans were isolationists, wouldn't go out of their way unless there was money involved. They kind of had this vision of, I guess you would call it the fat cats, that the United States would never accost itself to go to war unless it could get something out of it. Big reason they went to war.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why Hitler actually declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, he actually, and I read this somewhere, I'm not sure where, but he said to one of his aides, like, oh, the Americans, they're not going to have any military impact until like 1976 is what he thought.
He was actually basing that off World War One, the things that he had seen, because, the Americans came in at the very end of it. And even with the presence of American forces at the beginning of World War One, they didn't make an enormous contribution right away because the Germans had mounted a giant counteroffensive in World War One. But the very last year of World War One, of course, the Americans completely trampled over them. But yeah, Hitler was very ignorant of the capabilities of other countries. But that was also because Germany and Japan suffered a unique problem with production. They had this kind of craftsmanship where, if you take a German tank, for example, most German engineers built start to finish the same tank. They didn't diversify specialization so that there was assembly lines of people who built the tire tracks, this part, that part, this part. Until late into World War II, they never actually achieved that. Japan, there was people building parts of the airplanes in their backyards, talking about people in their own homes. It's incredible, like how they created the Zero Fighter for as long as they did, but it certainly wasn't productive. But for operation to hit Pearl Harbor, a lot of things needed to be done. One of the key concepts was to use aircraft carriers. And for those listening in the audience, you have to understand, not only was the general public not really aware or understood the future of what the carrier would play in the war, almost every single admiral, even including Yamamoto himself to some extent, still believed in an old school policy of, we call it the big gun policy. It's that battleships would wage a decisive war against other battleships, and that's how a navy actually fights. and that carriers was more or less kind of a supportive thing on the side. It wasn't the main piece on the board.
The reality that aircraft carriers were going to be the mainline ship was still just not appreciated at its time.
Not at all. And everybody got a taste of it just before Pearl Harbor. There was a single engagement called the Battle of Taranto, where the British attacked the Italian naval fleet at anchor. And they were using ferry swordfish, which, for anyone listening, picture World War I biplanes attacking a World War II modern and very powerful fleet. The Italians had a very strong navy.
And yet the effect
was overwhelming.
And I think Yamamoto was basically taking notes on this thing, and he kind of figured, well, if the British can do this with a single aircraft carrier with World War I biplanes
in shallow water,
then what if we like crank up the notch like 15 degrees, and instead of sending one aircraft carrier, we send, well,
all of them. And Yamamoto's chief guy under him at the time, who was going to be the mastermind behind some of the engineering aspects of Pearl Harbor, he had to figure out how to get torpedoes to go through the shallow water. They used wooden fins for theirs. The British had actually done something a little sillier, using wires and string to make sure that it hit the water at such an angle it wouldn't go too deep for their Toronto mission. A lot of people think, learning the Battle of Toronto, that it's X and then it creates, like, that's patient zero and that creates what happens at Pearl Harbor. It turns out that Yamamoto had already been creating his plan prior to that, about 2 months or so before, and the tail fin idea for the torpedoes was basically done by this point. But the Battle of Toronto, when he presented it to everybody who told him Pearl Harbor was insane, because he was pitching this like a businessman would, they had to acknowledge, yes, it did work, because the Battle of Toronto was devastating. They crushed half the Italian fleet that couldn't set sail for months. And Yamamoto, as he does multiple times in his career, he threatened to resign if they wouldn't go ahead with the Pearl Harbor idea.
So then on November of 1941, the pronunciation always gets me. I've heard Nagumo and then I've heard Nagumo.
Both are correct. It depends. If to give an example, when the Japanese pronounce their names as Anglophone, as people who speak English, we say things differently. So the name Tomoyuki Yamashita, most English people would say Yamashita. And it's proper to say it like this. For Nagumo, you can say Nagumo.
Yeah, I was always brought up with Nagumo. It just seemed right. And then all of a sudden, everybody was saying it differently. And as I've said numerous times before, pronunciation is not my forte. I have many faults, and that's one of them. So in November, the task force under Nagumo sets out. And this was a force consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 tankers. Each of them left off of Tankin Bay.
Yeah, so it's known as the Kido Butai, the greatest pilots in the world probably at that point in history. They gave the edge to the Japanese. Once the Japanese actually lose their veterans, or their veterans are shuffled around, who don't end up training the new generations of pilots for some reason. That's a very odd thing that happens to Japan. Japan is greatly diminished. But this force, under strict radio silence, which, despite certain conspiracy theories that persist to this day, was abided by. They actually locked the radios down, as they say, was traveling across the North Pacific to hit Pearl Harbor from the north. And they did a ton of deceptive maneuvers to make sure that the Americans had no idea what was going on. For example, the Japanese were well aware of the American intelligence networks that were watching their ship movements, and they made sure to do a rotation for months and months and months that looked normal, so that the carriers could simply escape, which looked like a routine operation to the Americans. They had no idea. And
they took pathways that were off the regular shipping routes, and they picked places because to some extent they knew kind of where the U.S. Navy's the PBY patrol planes were going to be checking out, so they kind of made it a point to stay away from that.
Mm-hmm. And they were also, at the same time, they had a man, I guess you could call him like a James Bond-like figure, was on the grounds in Hawaii, Takeo Yoshikawa, who was feeding them all the information daily about what ships were at port, where to expect ships, especially where the battleships were, because despite what people may think, it's sometimes funny to hear, but the main target was the battleships. Yamamoto would lament later that the carriers were not hit, but the main target had always been the battleships at Battleship Row. So this spy was feeding all the information up until the day before. That was his last transmission. And he was working with some German spies as well. And the German spies, not to get too much down the rabbit hole, were actually terrible at their job and they got caught, which is kind of funny. But the
Well,
code,
speaking of conspiracy theory, and then the aircraft carriers that were supposedly not there, I've heard the conspiracy theory is that FDR actually knew about this attack, and he wanted to be in the war so badly, but he was going up against such a strong American stiff headwind of isolationism that he purposely left the battleships there, including the Utah, which was kind of an old
call it
battleship,
an ex battleship at that point.
ex
Yeah.
battleship, and then he secretly sailed off the aircraft carriers and kept them out of harm's way, just in the nick of time, right? What do you think about that?
For it's funny because that is definitely the number one conspiracy theory when it comes to Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers perform routine operations, and they were, as much as people would hate to hear it, they were just on a routine operation. Actually, they were moving planes somewhere. So that's all that was going on. And it's very fortunate for the United States because yeah, if those aircraft carriers were hit, they were one of the first things that were used during the Pacific War, and they devastated the Marshalls and the Gilberts at the offset of the war. So they were desperately needed, and there was only 4 aircraft carriers in the Pacific at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. This is why I'm really glad I'm having you on for this show because I mean your insight on this is just it's spot on. So the attack on Pearl Harbor happens on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Admiral Nagumo launches the first of what was initially meant to be 3 attack waves.
Yes.
Only 2 of them kind of go in. Air bases throughout the island of Oahu are neutralized, making way for the torpedo and dive bombers to hit the ships. So
I
this
will
is
just
this,
add to that
sure.
because it's just a small piece of the puzzle that no one ever talks about. The first attack on Pearl Harbor was actually via midget submarines. There were
Ah,
5 of them. They tried to sneak into the harbor. Some there is talks that one of them managed to get a torpedo off on one of the ships in question, but more or less they all met horrible fates and they sunk. And I think the last one was found in 2003. The midget submarines were a horrible idea. I think actually Yamamoto hated the idea that they were attached to the operation. The USS Ward, which was a kind of a patrol ship that was out near the harbor, was warned of a periscope that they saw. They depth charged what was an enemy submarine before the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced, and they sent word of this through the chain of command, and it just got joggled up. So the waves come in and they hit the airfields that you had mentioned. It's Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and then later it's Bellows Field in the second wave. But just so people understand, when you were attacking something like Pearl Harbor, the first thing that you want to attack is whatever can be thrown back at you. So all of the aircraft on the island were the primary targets right away, just to get rid of them. And get rid of them, they did. The Japanese absolutely destroyed those fields
and the
before the ships.
Americans actually made it easier for the Japanese to do this. Their biggest concern was sabotage, and so their plan was to line up all the planes, kind of wingtip to wingtip, to make it easier to spot them and scan them. But that made strafing just so much easier.
Actually, it's identical to what happens in the Philippines with General Douglas MacArthur's situation. Caught on the ground. Well, some of them were in the air, but a lot of them are caught on the ground, completely destroyed. Before the ships are then hit by the torpedo bombers, which is unbelievable when you see some of the footage. To this very day, I happen to know an individual who uncovered brand new footage of the largest explosion at Pearl Harbor, which was the USS Arizona. Literally came out of the water when it blew up,
Right.
and it killed almost 2,000 people. Well, sorry, no, it was 1,000, like almost 1,200 people died on that alone. It's a huge tragedy.
I've actually been to Pearl Harbor and I've seen the memorial, and it's inspiring. If you look down into the water, you can still see that there's oil that's coming out of the wreckage of that ship. It's insane. The attack continues. The air bases, as you've mentioned, are neutralized. The overall attack lasts for 1 hour and 45 minutes, and the Japanese achieve complete success here. 200 planes destroyed with another 160 damaged is the total that I got. 19 ships altogether were hit, of which 4 battleships were either sunk. Another 4 were severely damaged. And I want to give a shout out to the Nevada because this is something that I just learned about. Nevada was the only battleship that was actually able to get underway,
Yeah,
correct?
tried to get out.
And
Yeah.
as it was making its way to the mouth of the harbor, so the way you have to think about the Pearl Harbor is that there's all these different little bays that all lead to this one mouth. And as it's making its way to that mouth of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese decide like, hey man, this would be a really great target to
Opportunity.
take out. And the captain of the ship decides instead of that happening, he intentionally beaches the ship so that in shallow water, so with the hopes that it can be repaired, refitted, and then hopefully sent into battle.
Because if he had sunk in front of the entry to Pearl Harbor, that would have been the cherry on top of the sundae because
Oh God.
they wouldn't be able to move it. The United States presence in the Pacific would have been, instead of six
Done.
months, you're looking at a year.
Yeah, there's a book I read, a what if scenario that says, what if instead of Admiral Nagumo in charge of this task force, it had been Yamamoto that was there? And basically, what he would have done was he would have sent in the third wave. He would have sent in his battleships to basically just destroy the island and wreck Hawaii. It's actually kind of a fascinating read. I got a question for you, Craig. So, what if it wasn't Nagumo? What if it was Yamamoto? And he had one of the battleships that was there, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was the Congo. This thing was massive.
Yeah, that could
And
launch 16-inch shells. Like that was a huge ship.
so, what if Yamamoto had ordered the Congo to sail right into the harbor of Pearl Harbor and then ordered his men to scuttle the ship right in the middle of that harbor?
Oh wow. I've never heard anyone bring that up. That would have been a fantastic idea. And that had, in World War
That,
One, that's
that's just
happened.
crazy enough for
Yeah.
Yamamoto to come up with. I mean, you're talking about 180 ships that couldn't get out at that point.
Yep. And unfortunately, the man that they send, Trichi Nagumo, he was the best way to describe this man is he was a by the books officer. You gave him orders, as dumb or smart as they were, he followed them no matter what. And he did not like Yamamoto. He did not like serving under Yamamoto. He thought Pearl Harbor was stupid. He also, later in life, thought the Midway operation was a very stupid idea. He didn't want to do it, but again, he was given charge to it because he was the most successful officer at the time because it was just endless victories under his belt. And when he came to the decision of whether to do a third wave or not,
yeah, he withheld the third attack because he felt that the element of surprise had been lost.
because the two carriers, well, there could have been three carriers for all the Japanese knew at this time. There could have been. They did not know where they were, and he thought that he was risking his force because they could attack them at any moment since they had lost the element of surprise. Ironically, if he had stayed and done a third wave, those two carriers probably would have come into the combat and been annihilated.
Which would have played into their hand, not to mention
Yeah.
the fact that the repair facilities and the oil tanks and all that other stuff, which
All
was their
intact.
main target, all of that stuff would have been destroyed. And that plays a huge part
Yeah.
because later in the war, those repair facilities made Pearl Harbor a viable base instead of having to ship everything back to the west coast of the United States for repair.
Yes.
So, yeah, there's that.
Because
They
all
were,
those ships that were hit was in shallow water and they were repaired in incredible time. Because so what if they were hit? So what if they sunk a bit? They weren't capsized at the bottom of the ocean or anything. A lot of them were, it was quite easy to fix them up. And in a few months, they were all operational.
well, after Pearl Harbor, we have battleships that are destroyed, severely damaged. It's estimated that over 2,400 men were killed, and the damage was so extensive that I heard it was pretty much covered up.
Yeah.
The Japanese, on the other hand, lost 29 planes, 5 midget subs, and the IJN now decisively held the initiative as what they were going to do next.
They held the entire Pacific Ocean. I mean, technically, the British had some Prince of Wales and stuff out there, but there's no one really to contest them. The only real big players in the Pacific were the Netherlands, the British, and the Americans. And the few forces that they had, let's say for America, for the Asiatic fleet that's closer to the Philippines, was insignificant. Couldn't do anything.
Let's talk about this expansion that Japan did, because this is probably one of the largest and most rapid expansions in history. Granted, a lot of it was over water, but still. The Japanese exploded at this point.
Dan Carlin calls it a supernova in the East.
Japanese expansion was extremely rapid. It was one of the largest in history.
Because I'm sure most of your audience is American. It's actually hard for Americans to think about this, but you have to take even time zones into account. The Philippines is being hit simultaneously. Thailand, Malaya are hit simultaneously as Pearl Harbor is hit. Everything is being hit. Uh, One of my favorite generals of the Japanese during this war, the Tiger of Malaya, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, he's the one that actually performs the Malayan campaign and later will take Singapore. And he is a very unique general in the Japanese army because he was, like most, he went to Germany to learn from their military, and he was very fascinated with Blitzkrieg. He got to see it firsthand, and he took it to the battlefield in Malaya. He incorporated the smaller tanks because the Japanese had terrible tanks, mind you, but he also was a big proponent of bicycles. So he had all of his men find out how many bicycles were in Malaya. The Japanese got into Malaya and stole all the bicycles from the locals that they could, and they used it to outrace the British all the way to Singapore.
And it sounds ridiculous,
It does
but
sound
in
ridiculous.
reality, the movement, speed is life.
Yeah.
And even having bicycles, if you can get even two people on the same bicycle, suddenly you have a very mobile army. It
Yeah.
makes a vast difference.
The British and Indian forces that were trying to build what you would call roadblocks or defensible positions all across Malaya, going from north to south, couldn't do a thing because every time they got into a new position, they're already being attacked every single time. And the psychological effect was every time that they heard these thousands of guys riding bicycles, they thought tanks were coming because there were tanks involved in motorized vehicles, terrified them. They basically ran all the way to Singapore in the end. And they were being attacked by a force that was numerically smaller than them.
At Singapore, you have one of the greatest defeats in British history.
And it's absolutely incredible. I know people will be screaming at me if I go into this myth, but they like to call it the bluff of Yamashita because he had 1/3 the amount of men. He was completely low on ammunition, low on fuel, didn't have necessarily enough artillery shells to actually finish the job because this was a siege basically to attack Singapore. And what he does is he just starts sending messages over saying, surrender. It's inevitable. I'm going to take you out because he has to take them out now or else it's going to get botched down for a very long time. And he had a time schedule.
The element of surprise works really well.
Of course.
And also, having cojones like that to be able to go in there and just say, hey, you just need to surrender. The British buy it. They just basically lay down all of Singapore. And I've also heard that with Singapore, the British mentality was that they were always expecting an attack from the sea.
Yes.
And so most of the armament and guns and placements and stuff like that were geared towards that. To have attack come from the land was something completely bizarre. It took him also by surprise.
I won't go too much into it, but there's actually a huge myth about this. So what you were talking about is the Gibraltar of the East, as they called it, Singapore, was a fortress.
Correct.
And they
Correct.
had these enormous naval guns. So these are shore batteries that are on top of the fortress that are aimed out at the sea because they're to attack ships that would bombard them. They could spin 180. So the myth has always been, they had these guns that couldn't turn around to shoot land forces.
Wow,
No, they could
That's
turn around.
good to know. That's good to know. But using naval guns to attack incoming land forces?
That's it. So armor-piercing rounds are used to shoot battleships. Armor-piercing rounds, when they're fired at land, they go straight into the dirt and explode, not doing anything to men who were standing upon the dirt. So when Yamashita took his forces from the north attacking Singapore, they were useless. They were lobbing shells that are like the size of vans at them. But these shells, which did kill some people, mind you, because yes, they are gonna, if they hit you, you're gonna die. They were very ineffective. And what
you're gonna vaporize if that thing hits you. I mean, there's not gonna be a body to find.
And Yamashita brilliantly put aside a bunch of small boats hidden in some foliage while he put all of his artillery in one place, made it seem like he had all the shells in the world because he just unleashed his entire artillery in a matter of days, just shot as much as he could as a diversion, wasting almost all of his ammunition. And then he stormed into Singapore and eventually Percival, who was in charge, he surrendered. He came to the peace table while Yamashita was sweating his ass off at the table because he knew he was bluffing. And Percival gave up one of the crown jewels of the British Empire. And this is also at the same time as the disaster of 4C. So the Prince of Wales had gone out legendarily out to sea to try and help in some naval battles, and like 100 Japanese aircraft just destroy it. It was one of the first times that they had seen in the open ocean aircrafts take out a capital ship, and it was a huge humiliation for the British.
Now, the Prince of Wales in particular, and again, you know this a heck of a lot better than I do. The Prince of Wales was to the Southeast Asian Pacific Fleet what the Hood was to the Atlantic Fleet.
Great comparison, yeah.
And when the Bismarck took out the Hood, talk about a way to really tick off the Royal Navy. I mean, at that point, the Royal Navy was all in to take out the Bismarck. Prince of Wales was kind of the same thing to Southeast Asia.
It had a legendary reputation too, so it was humiliating. The British were, I mean, it was a catastrophe, and it was an ignorant catastrophe because even the men on the ship didn't think that aircraft could do anything to them. The knowledge of the capabilities of a torpedo bomber against a moving battleship, it wasn't really known, honestly. So
Right.
they got taken out badly. And just to go over the many other areas, it's almost hard to say everything. But Thailand was attacked at the offset as well. Thailand put up kind of a lackluster effort to defend themselves, but they were playing the fence on whether they were going to join the Allies or the Japanese. They end up joining the Japanese quite quickly. The Philippines is, if anyone wants to know more about that, you can go straight over to any of my episodes or even Kings and Generals. I am the one who wrote the disaster of the Philippines. So Douglas MacArthur had changed all of his war plans to have an initial first strike capability. So if the Japanese were ever to threaten them, which the Philippines was the number one target, America thought under no circumstances it not going to get hit first. So Douglas MacArthur had this large fleet of bombers that he was supposed to use to hit what we know as Taiwan today. It was Formosa back then. And he just doesn't. And there's a huge, really messed up reason as to why. It has to do with his relationship with the president of the Philippines and all sorts of things. But he blunders the defense of the Philippines, and the Philippines falls into chaos very quickly.
No, he must have had a much better PR firm that was working for him.
It was his own.
Than it was his own, right? He was a man that kind of created his own will. But my point is, like, Kimmel, who was the commander at Pearl Harbor, I mean, he basically is forced to step down. MacArthur, on the other hand, he loses the Philippines. His men enter into that last-ditch attack or last-ditch defense at Corregidor, and then there is the Bataan Death March. He says his famous words, "I shall return."
Too big to fail, I like to call him.
He's too big to fail. That's exactly right. So why do you think the United States propped him up so much?
God, we might take the whole podcast this one, but Douglas, because as people who know my channel know me and my podcasts, I have a notorious reputation for going into Douglas MacArthur. I've read a lot of biographies on him. He had perpetuated himself to be a legendary figure. His dad
didn't he refer to himself in the third person a lot, like in his own? Gosh, when you start doing that, man, the sense of megalomania is just.
He spoke Shakespearean style. They describe him as America's Caesar, and it's so true. The people who knew him, like you have quotes where people be like, "Oh, he didn't have a staff; he had a court." He had a full publicity team with him at all times who wrote everything about him to always make it seem better than it was. They always basically lied on his behalf. The defense of the Philippines, for example, no one knew that it was honestly completely his fault. He had blundered a pre-planned defensive plan. He had ruined it himself when things weren't going well because he had planned to defend on the beaches idiotically. At the last minute, he goes back to what is War Plan Orange 3, fails. All the men, like you say, they end up running to Bataan with a third the supplies they were supposed to have because he never supplied it properly because he didn't have any intention to go through with that plan. He escapes the Philippines by leaving his subordinate, this poor unfortunate guy nicknamed Skinny, in charge, who was forced to surrender on his behalf.
Right. So therefore he doesn't surrender, he doesn't lose face, but it's a subordinate that did it.
So that we can actually get to the Doolittle raid later, I'll just say that MacArthur, he had this reputation and FDR couldn't afford to have him be captured. He was the highest ranking military official out there. And that's why he was pulled out of the Philippines in the first place, because of the fear if the Japanese grabbed him, they would have the number one hostage on their hands. So by doing everything that they did, it was kind of like a catch-22. FDR was forced to make this guy look like the fantastic general that could never lose, because they had to spin everything to be a little bit more positive. So when MacArthur ends up in Australia, he spends the whole war just glorifying himself more and more and more, taking more power, diverting the whole war to his cause, because he tries to go back to the Philippines famously.
Right.
And he made himself a rock star, and he held FDR at gunpoint for the whole war.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a famous statement by Yamamoto where he says that, I can guarantee success for 6 months, which he was kind of right at that. And the amount of casualties that the Japanese sustained in this rapid expansion was minuscule, even compared to their standards. They think they were estimating like anywhere between 15 to 33% casualties, but they ended up with like less than 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
In the process of this expansion, Yamamoto's famous statement was that I fear that all we have done is awakened a slumbering giant.
It actually wasn't him who said that, but a very good movie, popularized it. He said something. It's alleged that he said something to its effect, but there happens to be I can't remember the name of the other Japanese admiral. Another admiral had said something identical to it. So a lot of people think it's this other admiral, but in the Tora, very amazing movie, it's such a good quote that they put it in at the end, and it's captured everybody's mind ever since. That's like
it's quote. Captured my mind. Like I said, you know this better than I do.
No, but Yamamoto has said so many things that are identical to it. He's referred to America as being like the sleeping giant and stuff. So that's it fits exactly with as the movie said, because the movie acknowledges that he doesn't say it I think in the end credits, and they even say like this was the spirit of what he would have said if he had been asked at that time. And yeah, the Japanese, so they go supernova, they defeat, let's say, Hong Kong. They killed, well, I'm a Canadian, they killed those Canadians there. They took over Hong Kong, Thailand, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake, 2 other American held territories that go down with a fight, mind you, pretty brutal fight. Singapore falls. The Dutch East Indies campaign is just kicking off just before the Doolittle raid. The Abdicom Command, which is a coalition of like Australians, the British, the Americans, and the Netherlands, they're just getting wrecked. I mean, they have a naval force which is doing some damage to the Japanese, but it is minuscule, tiny. It's led by a pretty cool Dutch admiral who does some nifty things with submarines, but other than that, they're losing everywhere they go. They have no victories, no nothing.
And the Japanese are just on one string of victory after another. So based on this, awakening a slumbering giant is one thing, but giving it that firm resolve to fight is going to be a different thing. And FDR knew that the number one thing that he could lose is morale. American morale at this point is an all-time low. And why wouldn't it be? It looks ridiculous. Its fleet has been destroyed. The Japanese have overwhelmed the Pacific. It has given the British a black eye with the destruction of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Philippines have been taken, and MacArthur is now in Australia. So something needed to be done. Enter in the topic of our discussion, like 40 minutes into this?
That's why I was like, oh, look at the time.
So on December 21st, 1941, FDR meets up with his top brass, and he demands that retribution needs to be done. Yeah. And he's been demanding this essentially since Pearl Harbor. Something needs to be done. Exactly. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And nobody actually has anything that they come up with. They wanted to launch an attack to bomb or do some sort of damage. It has to be directly at the heart of Japan.
Yeah.
If you're going to make a mark, that's the place to do it. Unfortunately, all of the islands that you were talking about are not anywhere close to what fighters can reach. Same thing with the bombers. The closest thing that the Americans have at this point is going to be Midway. And even that is going to be out of the range of bomber attack.
They did have 3 options that they talked about. There was the idea to launch from China, but the air defenses of the entire Japanese Empire were directed in that direction. So they could have done something with the USSR out of Vladivostok or on the peninsula, but it didn't seem possible either because they couldn't get a good alliance going to do that, and the Japanese would uncover it beforehand. And the
And,
third
and
one was
the Russians, just to intercede, the Russians were apprehensive
yes,
to attack Japan because at this point you have to think in the war, December of 1941, the Germans were just outside the gates of Moscow.
Barbarossa, yeah.
So the last thing that Russia wanted to do was open up another front with Japan at this point. So they're going to be very apprehensive to help the United States in any way, shape, and form on that.
Yeah. And the third one, which is the most unique one because it's later talked about again, is the Aleutian Islands. The Americans acknowledged that it was theoretically possible to launch attacks against at least against Hokkaido from the Aleutians, but that one is disregarded quickly because the weather conditions were insurmountable. It was not a good area to lift off from.
Correct. I almost kind of feel bad for the Japanese soldiers that took a couple of those islands later in the war. Like if you were stationed up there throughout the war, that would kind of suck a little bit. Enter into the scene Francis S. Lowe. He was a submariner, and he had been watching in Virginia bombers taking off from an airfield, and there was an outline on the ground that was approximately 467 feet long, which was the distance of an aircraft carrier's flight deck. He came up with the idea that perhaps if we're going to be attacking Japan, what we could do is try to figure out a way to launch a bomber off an aircraft carrier, which had never been done before.
Certainly not.
Desperation calls for desperate measures. And this was reviewed by the upper brass, and then it was actually Bill Halsey that actually approved of it. Question was, who are they going to be putting in charge of what sounded like essentially a suicide mission? And the person that they found was Doolittle. James Jimmy Doolittle, Lieutenant Colonel, at this point, was kind of a Renaissance man. A lot of people just think of him as being just a very good aviator, but he was actually a very intelligent man. He had actually earned his master's and doctoral degree from MIT. He knew a lot of information about engineering. He understood airplanes backwards and forwards, specifically bombers. They brought him forward and they asked him, this is what we want to do. What do you think we should do? And his take on it, and immediately he came up to the same conclusion that everybody else had come up with. He said that the only thing that's going to work is a B-25. There were other bombers that they had in mind. I think the B-24 was a little too much of a hot rod, though it was very identical to a B-25. The B-26 Marauders just had too long of an airframe
their wings.
and wingspan. They also considered a B-23 Dragon. The B-25 Mitchells were the ideal candidate for this type of thing. They had the wingspan to get off an aircraft carrier. They had enough weight taken off of them, they could actually make the distance. The only downside was that they would be able to launch from an aircraft carrier, but landing on an aircraft carrier would be impossible. So it makes sense that they could take these B-25s and launch them off the flight decks. At which point, early in 1942, an intense program begins. Doolittle gets people together and starts training his bomber crews to do specifically that. Nobody's actually told what they're going to be doing. I think most of the men under his command could somewhat kind of figure this thing out.
Oh, it would have been kind of a little bit obvious with what they were doing. Like you had said, they went out into a field and they put these flags to mark certain distances, like 200, 300, 500 yards. And, they were training these pilots to take off in an extreme way. So, for example, a lot of these pilots were taught, just like when you have a car, put on the brakes, but kick the engine up, get the engine hot and running, and then like jackrabbit to accelerate as fast as you can at the offset so that you can take off from a shorter and shorter distance.
And then everything on that bomber was basically stripped down to just about nothing. B-25 Mitchell had a range of about 1,300 miles. It carried a crew of 5. It usually can carry up to a bomb load of 5,000 pounds. And its wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches allowed it to launch off the aircraft carrier.
It will be configured to carry a 1-ton bomb payload.
So 1 ton of bombs in order to make this thing happen. And again, the idea behind this was not so much to inflict so much damage, but the fact that Americans could fight back. The way that it worked out was that on April 2nd, after all of these trials are done, B-25s are brought to Alameda here in San Francisco, and they're loaded on board the USS Hornet. Task Force 18 was the designation for it, and it sailed out of San Francisco Bay on April 2nd, making its way west. On April 13th, Task Force 16, under the command of Halsey with the USS Enterprise, which I believe was his flagship,
Yep.
meets up with Task Force 18 at Midway. Now, this is an extreme risk for several different reasons. At this point, not only are they sailing into Japanese-held water, but the fact that they are essentially just an isolated task force with only 2 carriers, and of those 2 carriers, the Hornet has B-25s on its flight deck, which precludes its ability to launch its own fighters.
Yeah, so in carrier terms, you say you're running cap. So that's a fighter
Right.
squadron over your ship just to run a screen as to anything that's coming against you. But Enterprise has to run cap for itself and the Hornet during this operation. They do have escorting vessels, of course, but we're talking about mere peanuts compared to anything the Japanese could throw at them.
Exactly. And if that task force was spotted and the Japanese were able to retaliate in force, that would be a very difficult thing for it to get out of.
Yes, and they do get spotted.
So on April 18th at approximately 7:38 a.m., they bump up with a Japanese ship. This thing is so tiny it doesn't even show up on the radar. It is the Nito Maru. The USS Nashville immediately unleashes, and you almost have to feel sorry for the people on board this ship.
Extremely embarrassing, yes.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way. Like, you have basically a small ship that some people even attribute to being almost like a fishing vessel.
Yeah, it was about a 70-ton. It has steel hull, but it's a what you would call a picket boat. So it probably was a fishing ship once upon a time.
So the task force unleashes. There's video footage of the Nashville and some support vessels just wrecking havoc. And I always wonder if somebody would like actually sit down and calculate how many bullets were actually, or how many shells were actually thrown at this thing.
Oh, I have the number.
Oh, you have? Okay, tell me.
Oh, yes, because it's a huge. Halsey would go on the record as saying it was one of the most embarrassing things he ever seen. So the Nashville couldn't hit it. It would fire 928 6-inch shells.
Oh my God.
Wildcats were from the cap came in, and I don't know if it was a combined thing, like 20,000 rounds were fired, like a full magazine clip from one of their planes to take this thing down. It was so embarrassing. The little ship fired back, and they couldn't even shoot to like the half point. They could basically make half the range towards the Nashville. So they were
but it was a symbolic shot.
Yeah,
not so much across the bow, but at least into the water.
But what's crucial to the story is they did have radio equipment. It was a picket ship. Its whole purpose was to say if anything was coming in. They report back to Tokyo. Well, it actually gets picked up by the great super battleship Yamato that 3 American carriers are about to attack the home islands. And a lot of people thought it was absurd in Japan when they heard this radio signal.
How can something possibly be attacking us? And that kind of goes into the mindset of the Japanese in the mainland. They did not think they could be touched.
Nope.
Going back to the time when this fleet was picked up, the decision was made that they needed to launch the bombers. This was going to be their opportunity. If they don't do it now, then they're not going to have a chance. Now, the initial plan was to get within 400 miles of the Japanese mainland and launch the bombers at that point in time. But they are probably about 650 miles out at this point, so 150 miles beyond where they need to be. At approximately 8:20 a.m. on April 18th, 1942, the fleet turns into the wind, and the Hornet starts launching the B-25s. Doolittle is in the leading bomber, and it's a very difficult situation to launch in. First, they're not sure if they're going to make it. Second, the wind conditions and weather conditions at the time were very adverse, and so not only does he have to fly this B-25 into the wind off a very short distance, but he also has to time it so that the bow of the ship is going to be high in the water. Miraculously, he's able to make it off. And he's followed by the other 15 B-25 Mitchells. 4 hours later, they spot the mainland of Japan. A lot of people think that it was just Tokyo that was going to be the main target. So Tokyo was not only the main target, but there were also several others: Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. And as they approach the mainland of Japan, they start fanning out in order to attack several different targets. Most of the bombers go after Tokyo. Several go after Nagoya, and a couple go after Osaka. I believe it was just one bomber that actually went after Kobe. Let's see
Yeah,
here.
and they're flying in groups of 3 bombers each. There's basically 5 waves of them, and they are flying dangerously low to the sea level at the beginning and then low to the ground because they've been fed inside information from a man named Jirika, who was a attaché to Tokyo for a long time before the war. And he basically told them everything he knew about the outlook of Japan and where the anti-aircraft defenses would be and how they operated.
And to Doolittle's credit, he had been training his crews to fly the bombers as if they were fighters, low
Yep.
to the ground, making erratic maneuvering. And this served that formation extremely well because the anti-aircraft guns were not trained to hit bombers that low.
And not
They
only
were
that, they to be blunt, it's ironic to say, but the same element of surprise that was found at Pearl Harbor, where initially a lot of the military staff on some of these ships saw some Japanese planes showing up, and they're like, "Oh, that's clearly some of our planes." Over in Japan, in Tokyo, many people saw these planes and they just looked at them and they saw the emblem, which kind of resembled an older emblem of the Japanese of once upon a time, although it had the star on it. They were confused by this. They're like, "Oh, those are Japanese aircraft, I guess."
yeah, let them through.
Yeah.
There's actually Japanese fighters that engage the bombers, but
Mhm.
even then, they're not able to take any of these things down.
One small story, because I think this will blow people's mind. One of the bombers that was, I think, in the same formation with Doolittle himself went over Tokyo Bay, and at like fate, at the exact same time, this is allegedly this is this close. An aircraft is bringing Hideki Tojo somewhere because he's going to a meeting, and he alleged, someone on his staff says he noticed one of these bombers that was coming in. They flew so close that he remarked, "Is that a Caucasian guy flying that aircraft?"
Oh, no way.
And it's one of those things
That
where I have a hard time
can't be
believing it,
true.
but yeah, apparently.
Well, in either case, if you've got Tojo flying in Tokyo Bay, then that's going to make the Japanese fighter pilots even more apprehensive to shoot anything down.
Yeah, because there was fighters, like you said, everywhere, and initially they weren't firing back. They just watched these planes go by. No one knew any better at the beginning.
Now, I heard that one of the things that Doolittle did was he attached the peace medals that the Japanese gave the American government
Yeah,
to the bombs themselves before he dropped them out of the bomb bay door. I think that's just a. And I wonder, they probably didn't find any of those medals afterwards, but man, if they did, I think that would be the ultimate FU.
that would definitely.
So the bombs are unleashed, and the damage that it does is fairly minimal. The bombers don't hit anything that has a civilian kind of vibe to it. They definitely want to stay away from like the Imperial Palace, that kind of thing.
Strict orders not to. They fly directly over it on purpose, but they had direct orders not to bomb the Imperial Palace.
Yes, and that's much more of a psychological type of thing. I mean, I think having a bomber fly over the Imperial Palace and not do anything is probably the perfect response. If it did bomb the Imperial Palace, I think that would have kind of bolstered morale more than anything.
It would have really fired them up, and Emperor Hirohito had to be escorted to a bomb shelter because of this.
That is the ultimate humiliation.
It's a loss of face for both the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy.
The bombs themselves don't do that much damage as far as from a military standpoint. In fact, the damage that's been done is fairly negligible. They do hit some military targets in the other areas in Nagoya and in Kobe, but for the most part, this is stuff that the Japanese can rebuild very quickly.
They did hit. There is an odd small story. There was a light carrier that was being designed. It was actually from the hull of a old battleship that got reconfigured. It was the Riho, and it gets hit by a single bomb, and it delays it for 6 months, which is in parallel to what happened to ships at Pearl Harbor.
After that, the bombers have done what they needed to do. They have to make it back to China. Again, they launched prematurely because the task force was discovered.
Yes.
And not all of them are going to make it. So altogether, there were 16 bombers. As the bombers are making their way from Japan, they go right into a storm. Visibility is almost down to nothing. This doesn't bode well for them. One of the bombers has to veer off. There was an issue with its carburetor, which basically made it use up more fuel than anticipated. And it has to land in Vladivostok. And my understanding is that the Russians did not want to break any treaty violations, so the crew was taken as prisoners of war, but they were treated really well, and I'm sure they were given a lot of like vodka or something.
Oh, he had a great
Then
time. Yeah, they did.
yeah, the Russians showed him a really good time, and then afterwards they staged their escape. You know, like, oh no, please don't run away. No,
Exactly. Yes.
don't go through that door. No, what? And they run like directly out of Russian prison right to the British consulate, and then they're they're
Yeah.
safe. The remaining bombers. So there were 80 airmen altogether, of which most of these crash landed in China. Doolittle himself tells his men to bail out, sets the bomber on autopilot, and then bails out himself. He's the last man off the plane. And then most of the bombers crash land. Some places I've read it was 64 that actually make it. Others say 61. Can you comment on that?
Of men who evade the capture and the death later, it's 69, I believe. But 5 men are captured in Jiangxi province. So a lot of these pilots, they're landing in Zhejiang and Jiangxi province of China. So these are hidden airfields. So, like you said, the ones that crashed in the ocean, there were guys who had survived by swimming ashore, but they got really lucky. But there were some others that drowned. So 3 guys died at the offset.
And even the ones that drowned in the ocean, my understanding is that their bodies were actually recovered after the war, and they were brought back here, San Francisco, and they're buried. They're interred in Golden Gate Cemetery.
Oh wow!
Of the men that land, a couple of them are executed by the Japanese. Most of them actually make it back.
And just to make a point of this, 8 men are captured. Most of the Japanese leadership in the IJA wants to kill them all immediately. A trial was forced. It's a mock trial, mind you. They're transported over to Tokyo for this. Hideki Tojo is scared about killing them all. He thinks there'll be repercussions to this diplomatically. So he goes to Emperor Hirohito to talk about the matter. And they agree that the emperor will allow 5 men to survive. So 3 are executed out of the 8. The other 5 men will go on. They'll live throughout the entire war, except for one who does succumb to beriberi disease and dysentery.
Right.
All of them almost die from starvation.
Of the men that actually made it out of Japanese incarceration, some of them actually lived well past the year 2000. Here's the thing. The Japanese actually have to make an announcement. They broadcast that their homeland has been attacked.
Oh, yeah.
And ironically, it's the Japanese broadcast that gives Halsey the information that his raid has actually been successful.
Yes.
Now, the Chinese population that harbored these men, the reprisal against them is extremely vicious.
Yeah, if we do have a little bit of time, I'd like to go into details about that because it's very
this is an overlooked thing in history. Yeah. They glamorize the raid. They talk about how great Doolittle was, but they don't talk about this. I think it's really important that you talk about this.
What ended up happening is they interrogated the 8 guys immediately from the offset by torturing them on the 18th. The Americans are actually feeding them bullshit. So they're telling them that a mystical supercarrier has transported these B-25s, or some of them say, hey, we came from the Aleutians. Ironically, the Japanese believed, a lot of them theorized that these were coming from the Aleutians, possibly from a supercarrier. They thought that was plausible. From a secret base in the Philippines, and there was even some insane guy who thought there was a secret base in Japan. But they torture these officers, and they eventually find out exactly what had happened, that it was USS Hornets, these are B-25s, how they did it and everything. Japanese Imperial Army then is thinking, okay, so they landed into China. They landed predominantly in Zhejiang and Jiangxi province. Obviously, the Chinese are helping them. What the Japanese decide to do is absolutely horrifying, is known as Operation Seigo. If you look it up on Wikipedia or something, it would come up as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. They release 53 battalions with the primary mission is to neutralize all these secret air bases and forward air bases that are in the Zhejiang-Jiangxi provinces. They succeed easily. It's one of the worst assaults that they perform upon the Chinese Nationalist Army, but as well as the civilians. This is one of the first times a other unit is going in the background behind the army, and this is Unit 731, the biological warfare unit that is operating out of Manchuria. They unleash bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera bombs, every biological weapon that they have at their disposal. They poison wells. They poison and contaminate food. They contaminate candy to give to children. Even their own officers, 1,000 out of like 17,000 Japanese die as a result of this from the contamination of biological weapons. This leads to the estimation Chiang Kai-shek said later on, like something like 250,000 people died as a result of this extermination. And Chiang Kai-shek would go on the record. He cables FDR, and I have the quote right here of what he says to him. Japanese troops slaughtered every man, woman, and child in those areas. And the Japanese, there's no mercy. It's the same thing you would hear in the rape in Nanking. Villages just razed to the ground and everyone killed. And it was in retaliation for them aiding the Americans during the Doolittle raid.
It's just incredible to hear that. It's sobering. From one perspective, you can say that, that it was their homeland that was attacked and their loss of face, but that kind of reprisal seems extreme by any measure.
When it comes to World War II, I like to always parallel that when the Germans were fighting the Allies in the Western Front, when they came after D-Day, they were fighting with white gloves on. The Eastern Front against the Soviets, it was unparalleled, disgusting violence with the Einsatzgruppen and stuff going around. When the Japanese were operating against the Chinese, it was a race war. They were subhumans to them. They did untold horrors, and Unit 731 is a particularly nasty group that was involved in this. They're basically one of the first biological warfare groups ever created.
Incredible. I'm really glad that you brought that up. I mean, like I said, this is something that's almost completely glossed over. It's kind of an unfortunate thing that is not acknowledged more in the history books. In the aftermath of that raid, America was invigorated.
It actually came at a perfect time because this is right when the Bataan Death March and everything is kicking off and the fall of Singapore. So it kind of came arguably one of the best times it could to raise morale.
You would see that in what would happen subsequently after this. You would have the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first time when you had two major forces that are confronting each other where actual surface ships don't actually come into contact with each other. A few months after this raid, in June of 1942, you have the Battle of Midway. In the aftermath of the raid, the Japanese had to rethink their strategy. Mm-hmm. A lot of the Japanese mentality was now geared towards protecting the home islands a little bit more. One of the things that the Japanese High Command came up with was that it needed to neutralize the American carriers.
And I would like to make this point because the most important aspect of the Doolittle raid is it forced Midway. So the Doolittle raid happened coincidentally at the exact same time Yamamoto was arguing for a new operation. Yamamoto had been pitching the Midway operation from the very offset of this war. He was always transfixed with a decisive naval battle. The Japanese doctrine of the Navy was you win a decisive battle, you knock him out, and then that's how you're going to win the war. Everyone was against him, including all of his colleagues. They thought it was stupid. Right when the Doolittle raid happened and they got hit, Yamamoto, he literally was sick to his stomach. He locked himself in his room. Admiral Ugaki had to take charge, and he ordered every available vessel to go attack the USS Hornet and the Enterprise to try and catch him before they could escape. Nagumo himself was coming back from the Indian Ocean with the Kido Butai, and he was tossed on a wild goose chase. It was embarrassing. The Japanese Navy had lost face. The Emperor could have been killed. It was a disaster. Like you said, they had to bring back 4 Army air squadrons to be maintained within the Japanese home islands from 1942 to 1943 that would be necessary for operations in the South Pacific. It actually would hurt their New Guinea campaign. So the Doolittle raid, you could argue, dampened the attack on Port Moresby, something I would argue. And it led to the Coral Sea battle as well. But for Yamamoto, he told everyone the day after the raid, when he finally came out of his room, you know what? These Americans had to have come from Midway. We cannot allow American carriers to be operating so close to the home islands. They could destroy everything. So the American carriers were an obsession. Yamamoto basically drove it home. We have to destroy the American carriers because look what they can do. They can attack Tokyo. It worked. The Naval General Staff went along with this. Even for a few members of the Imperial Army said yes, on a condition that they would invade the Aleutian Islands because they did think that the Aleutian Islands could also be used against them in the same manner. Midway was a jaw-dropping blunder that really ruined things for Yamamoto. They were not defeated. People like to call it the turning point of the war. Technically, it was a turning point, not the turning point. That would be Guadalcanal. But Doolittle and his raid is exactly what caused Midway to occur at the time it occurred and the way it occurred. So one could
Yeah.
argue for such a small event, it led to the victory for America in the end. But like dominoes, Doolittle started it all.
And again, it all comes down to the fact that morale was restored, and
Yeah.
at that point, America was definitively in the war to win it. So going back to Doolittle, he surmised that he had lost all these bombers. What's the American government going to do to me? Initially, his thought was that he was going to be court-martialed. Instead, he was brought back, and he won the Medal of Honor. Many men in his raiding group were also decorated heavily for this. And later, after the war, in 1959, Tucson, Arizona awarded 80 silver goblets for the initial 80 airmen who had been part of this raid. Every year after that, they would meet and they would sip Hennessy cognac from these silver goblets. As an airman would die, the goblet was turned upside down. In 2019, we're talking just a few years ago, the last man of the Doolittle raid, the co-pilot of Doolittle himself, a man by the name of Dick Cole, died at the age of 103. He was the last surviving member of the Doolittle raid.
Incredible. 103. I always find that most fail to see the greater significance of such a small event. Many say, yes, it was the morale booster that gave, that oomph to America, and they finally gave a black eye to Japan. But like I said, operationally, it actually caused a catastrophe for the Japanese. The changes that they made, everything that Yamamoto went through to force his Midway operation, which saw corrections, the army added on the Aleutians and the idea to invade the atoll of Midway itself, and it ruined the operation. Doolittle did more than he would ever know at the time.
Exactly. Well, Craig, your knowledge on this is just absolutely incredible. Anybody listening at home, please check out his channel. His content is really good. Not only is he doing his own channel, but he's also a writer for Kings and Generals, which I think pretty much everybody has heard of who's into history. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You want to, yeah, why don't you do just like a quick shout out for yourself too?
Oh, sure. So, like you had said, I do write for Kings and Generals, and I'm the narrator and host of two other podcasts. So there's the Pacific War Week by Week and the Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Myself, I have the Pacific War channel over on YouTube, and I have podcasts, episodes. It's a chronological series going from 1830s all the way up to the end of the Pacific War. And I even do, funny tier lists and silly videos. So yeah, if you like the Pacific War and other things about Asia, come check me out.